Hello, everyone, and welcome to an episode of the Dairy Signal. Great discussion before you, and always very timely, or at least we try to keep it timely for you. But what better way to stay timely when we think about data, specifically when you think about our ability to own it, control it, if that's possible, and the implications. So as you tune in today's discussion, if you're able to listen to us live, please, by all means, ask your questions. You're able to do so with that box along the side, or if you're listening on your phone, scrolling down further. For those that are listening, I promise you that today's speaker, Bill Omican, is very accessible and willing to answer your questions after the fact by all means too. So without further ado, I will dive right in because obviously you didn't come here for me. You really came here for the expert advice. But today we have Bill Omican. He's a professor of practice law and local government law educator. He's with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Extension, and we're excited to have him here today. So Bill, I think you've been a part of the Signal before, but I don't want to take that for granted. So for our new listeners or those that are tuning in today, if you could give us just a quick little further background on you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Cassie, and thanks for the invitation to talk today. I grew up on a farm. I will admit it was in western Minnesota, just south of Fargo, North Dakota. I've served in a lot of different roles within agriculture. I was president of the Wisconsin-Minnesota Cooperative Association for 14 years. I spent 6 years at the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection as head of Trade and Consumer Protection. And then I spent about 8.5 years working as the Deputy Agriculture Commissioner for the state of Minnesota while I was actually living in the state of Wisconsin. So that's a little bit of my agriculture background.
Yeah, just say that all in one big mouthful. Well, we're excited to have you here today because you and I had the privilege of talking offline here and just kind of going into all things data. It continues to change day in and day out. So as far as like thinking of as a fellow dairy farmer, what do I need to know? Like, how can I protect not only my business interests, not only today, but moving forward? So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you again, Cassie. So I have a presentation. I have a series of slides. Please, anyone who's listening in, if you have questions, put them into chat. And Cassie will field those questions, and at the appropriate time, she will ask them. And I welcome questions at all points. I'll try to get through as much of this presentation before we get to questions. But again, if you have a burning question that goes to a specific slide, please let me know. So just as in terms of a roadmap, what I'm going to talk about at the beginning and very quickly is about the digital transformation of American agriculture. We're analog, meaning we're using non-data or digitized systems back as recently as 5 or 6 years ago for many of us. And now a lot of agriculture is becoming digitized. And we'll talk more about how that's happening, what that looks like. Then secondly, I'm going to talk about the big ag data trust issues raised by farmers and ranchers as all this data is being produced. What are some of the concerns that farmers and ranchers, and I do speak from time to time to ranchers out to the west, and so I always say farmers and ranchers, although in Wisconsin, we usually just say to farmers. I'm going to talk about what it means to actually own the data that's produced on your dairy farm operation and how that is decided. Then I'm going to talk about who really has control over your data, because ownership is one thing, but ownership is something entirely different. And in terms of the ag data world, this is very, very important. Then I'm going to talk about a possible cooperative role. I'm a person who's been in cooperatives all my life. I didn't mention that I initially began as a cooperative attorney in a law firm in Minneapolis. And so I've been in cooperatives now about 36 years. And so I always have to add in that. And then finally, what's the bottom line for you as a Wisconsin dairy producer? So that's our roadmap for today. So let's start off with just talking about the digital transformation of American agriculture. And I have about 4 slides on this. We're moving into smart farming. So we have remote sensing devices that have been incorporated mostly by manufacturers and tractors, planters, crop sprayers, combines, drones, robotic milkers, pretty much anything that's used in a typical Wisconsin dairy farm operation. Robotic milkers, maybe not so typical, but still used in a number of operations. But they're smart devices, and so they're generating data in a way that our equipment never used to do that. Provides certainly some economic and environmental benefits. The smart devices or smart sensors in the various types of farm equipment help determine the most efficient and effective use of when we're out planting, when we're fertilizing, when we're using pesticides and herbicides. And like all of you, growing up with my father, who was also a conservationist, he wanted to use the lowest amount of chemical possible to get the highest yield on our farm operation. And then I grew up in an area where irrigation is important. And of course, in the central sands of Wisconsin, irrigation is important as well for the potato industry. For irrigators, for example, just as another example, smart sensors help determine the rate and timing of the water application. So you're not flooding the crop, you're not denying that crop moisture so that it can't grow and prosper. So there are a lot of beneficial uses to incorporating smart digital agriculture into today's farming. However, as we're doing this, it generates two types of data. It generates small data and then big data. So just before I get into the definition of small and big data, this is just some basically illustrations of how what's known as the Internet of Things, IoT, has impacted agriculture. And so I've already talked about drones, certainly machines, soil monitoring, sensoring, and water management, talked about that. But you can see that there are lots of different applications, and the applications continue to grow dramatically. As a part of that, though, the amount of data being collected continues to grow dramatically as well. And so I just want to throw a couple pictures into the presentation. So let's start with small data. Small data or data, I don't care which one you use. I use both interchangeably, not sure whether one's better than the other. But small data refers to data produced on your individual farming operation. Typically, it's a relatively small geographic range. However, I work with a number of wheat farmers up in Saskatchewan who will own up to 12,000 acres, not just a small geographic range compared to your typical Wisconsin farm. But there's not enough variation typically to determine product efficacy, so the effectiveness of that product. So small data isn't really used by manufacturers in and of itself to determine how well a product responded within that environment and what effect it had on crops. And so what they do is then they create what's known as big data. And big data is data that's collected through an agricultural technology provider, ATP, probably one of the last times I'll use that acronym. I hate using acronyms, but just so you're familiar with it, as they take data from all these farms across the state of Wisconsin, potentially farms in Minnesota and Illinois and Michigan, and then they start to combine it with weather and climate data, USDA agricultural statistics, land use. So what's the topography of my farm? What land is cropped? What's in trees? Because I own farmland in southern Wisconsin where I live, west of New Glarus, and I certainly have some in crop and some in trees because I'm in the driftless and the hillsides we don't farm. But animal and animal production, crop and crop production, you can see the rest there, soil and weed information. So all this information gets brought in together, aggregated amongst many, many farms. So then what happens from there? So yeah.
There. So it does really rely on your small individual. I don't mean small farms, but I mean like the individual businesses, but it's going to pool all of them together to meet more of those bigger claims. Or
the really valuable data is the data coming from individual farms. But as an individual farm, it doesn't necessarily have a lot of value until it's aggregated with other farms.
Okay, thank you.
That helped? Okay, thanks for the question. And so your ag technology provider partners with large technology providers like Amazon Web Services and Google Ventures. You've heard those names. And I remember about 8-9 years ago when I first started getting interested in ag data, I started hearing about Amazon having interest in this. Like, why would Amazon be interested or Google Ventures? Well, because they understood that there was a lot of data out there that could be aggregated. And as we'll talk later, there's value in all that aggregated data. So they started to basically smell money and opportunity. And so then these technology providers partner with your John Deere's, with your Bayer, with companies like that that are selling you tractors or chemicals, ag chemicals. And what they'll do is they'll use techniques to analyze, interpret the data. So you've all heard of artificial intelligence. And it sounds like Cassie's going to have me do a later presentation on artificial intelligence in Wisconsin farms and what's known as machine learning, which is the learning. So the machine is learning from all this data to predict what the next word is in a sentence, for example. And so it's a process of learning from data. And in some places, it starts to kind of replace the human mind. That's what generative artificial intelligence, again, I won't be tempted to run off in that. But then there's lots of statistical analysis, map analytics. You can read those that are on the screen. All this is brought together, looking at the data from your individual farm and from all the other farms, and it starts to create recommendations. So the recommendations can help improve your crop yields to the extent that you're raising corn, for example, as feed for your dairy cattle, your environmental outcomes. So to the extent that you're applying herbicides, pesticides, how can we reduce that on-farm use? And also, what kind of economic return? So what kind of yield did I get for the corn that I planted or the wheat or whatever you happen to be planting? And then secondly, it also provides what's known as predictive analytics. And predictive analytics is where it uses artificial intelligence, machine learning to analyze all of this data that's been collected from all these farms across Wisconsin and the Midwest. And it starts to predict if we apply a certain chemical to a certain type of farmland or cropland, what's likely to be the outcome of that? Is it going to raise yields? Is it going to lower yields? So it starts to do predictive analytics. And what it does is start to create basically an economic value for your land that's separate from the way you and I tend to think about it, which is I've got 40 acres next to me. What's land typically going in Western Greene County, and how much am I willing to pay for that? But instead, it's deciding what is the productive potential of your cropland. And so then this information gets sold to third parties. And most of the time, sometimes it's ag technology providers trying to get more information about where they should be selling products and services, but it also goes to hedge funds and to others who may be interested in purchasing farmland. Now, in Wisconsin, we have a corporate farming law and an alien ownership law that prohibits corporations from owning more than 640 acres. But hedge funds are buying up agricultural land in other parts of the United States where these laws don't exist. And they're using this type of data to help them figure out what is the true value of this land and how much should I be willing to pay for it.
Then
Now,
Bill,
having said, oh, yeah, go ahead,
sorry,
Cassie.
on this note, like I'm thinking about like my management team. So I'm thinking of like
Right,
um my nutritionist, my soil
right.
guy, like all of those really key experts that I bring in and I rely on them. I could be dangerous. I could go through and kind of run some of these reports to just kind of see what's going on in the area and probably funnel it in a little bit more specific to my farm.
Right.
But to be resourceful with these tools, I would then release all this data back to my management team and be like, okay, looking at this, we can strategize a little bit further. So it theoretically could help us hone in smarter, but still
Absolutely.
relying on that human, the real human brain to take it further.
Right, absolutely. So having access to your data electronically helps you to be able to, and I don't want to sound too much like a professor, but manipulate, do some analysis of that data to figure out what are going to be the best practices on my farm. And so you've got these third parties that are purchasing this, but you're also hopefully getting the benefit from it, your seed salesmen, from your pesticide, herbicide salespeople who are coming in with this data because their companies are collecting this data and analyzing it and helping make recommendations to you. What is the best herbicide to plant on your crop or plant? Sorry, what's the best herbicide to apply to your crop at what time of the year based on what types of pests that might be out in the field, which could be determined in part through using drones, and they're collecting data as well. And so there's just lots of different examples of beneficial uses of this type of digitized agricultural data. So who holds farm data in the United States? So these just list some of the key ones. It's not an exclusive list, but Climate Field View, which many of you are familiar with because probably a number of you have contracts with Climate Field View, subsidiary of Bayer. Bayer is considered to own about 53% of the world's agricultural data. And so huge holder of agricultural data, and not just in the United States, but all across the globe. And of course, Bayer is a very, very large ag business. And of course, they purchased back a number of years ago Monsanto, and a lot of data is generated from smart devices that are used during the time that Monsanto type of products are applied. But Climate Field View partners with Amazon Web Services. Then you have Winfield Crop Plan, Winfield United. Many of you know that's owned by Land O'Lakes. They actually use their own in-house ag technology, so they're not using Amazon or Google. Farm Business Network, some of you may be members of Farm Business Network. They partnered with Google Ventures, Syngenta, Farm Shots and Farm Management, and Edge, which many of you know, Syngenta is owned by ChemChina. They're collecting all of this data. John Deere, Corteva, Cargill, just lots of different companies out there holding American farm data. So they're collecting the data off your farm. If you're using their products and services, they're then using it and aggregating it to develop recommendations for you, or in some cases, again, predictive analytics that they're selling to other parties. Now, given that all this data is being produced and given that farmers are presumably, and I think in many cases, getting good recommendations, but they're not getting money for the data that's been being produced on their farm. There's no payment system typically in place. Farmers wonder, okay, how am I getting the advantage from this? Again, you're getting the recommendations, but there have been some concerns that have been raised. There have been surveys done of American farmers and also Canadian and Australian farmers, and some in the European Union. And farmers believe that information technology like this, digitized agriculture, can increase efficiency, can lower your costs. You don't have to buy as much ag chem, can increase your yields and improve farm management decision making. However, there's some potential downsides, and they all really revolve around trust. How much do we trust those we're sending our ag data to? Because is this data secure? Is it private? So my on-farm data, is it being shared with others? Could there be a data breach based on problems with the technology used by my technology provider, whether it's Bayer, whether it's Winfield, whoever it happens to be? Who really owns that data? And that's what we're here to really talk about today. And how can this be potentially used by competition? In this case, hedge funds. Can they compete against me to purchase farmland when I'm out in the market looking to add on to my farming operation? And what does this really mean for market power? If Bayer holds all this ag data, what kind of market power do they have against me, an individual dairy farmer here in the state of Wisconsin? One of the things that the surveys show that there is absolutely more comfort from a farmer's perspective when they know that the ag tech provider is a farmer-owned cooperative. And so farmers tend to trust their cooperatives. And I know that might sound like a bias coming from a guy who works in co-ops, but this is what the research shows. Farmers trust the data that goes to the co-ops because they own the co-ops. They can run for the board of directors. And so there's not quite the same fear of the data going to other parties that are not cooperatives. So I've been part of a study being done, and I'm going to do a little bit of reference here to Canada. And not so much the United States for the next two slides, but Canadian universities in particular have been very interested in this data issue now going on for about 5-6 years, and who really owns and controls the data. And because of my interest, they're working with me as an American attorney who happens to be one of the few attorneys in the United States who can practice law in Canada, because I'm also a barrister and solicitor in Canada. I've done the analysis who actually owns this data coming off of farms, and then who controls the data. And if you're interested in a guidebook that's been made particularly for farmers, and I will tell you that what I wrote for Canada pretty much equally applies to the United States. There's a link right there, and feel free to access this. This was built on a previous study done at the University of Saskatchewan. University of Saskatchewan is Canada's largest agricultural university. I happen to be working on my doctorate at the University of Saskatchewan, and so I joined with several professors on doing this report on digital technologies and the big data revolution. So if you're interested in that, I have the link over on the right side of the page, and you can read about this in much greater depth. So let's move into the farm ownership of ag data. And this is based off of contracts. And so this is really determined by contracts, not so much by the law. The law, Wisconsin law, doesn't say that who owns this ag data. It's through contracts. And so the ag tech provider agreements or contracts typically make clear that you as the farmer, when you have smart devices in tractors or whatever on your farm, you own your on-farm data. So you own it. And you can look at the Bayer Climate Field View contract. And in section 4.1, it makes it clear. I've restated it below. And it says that between you and climate, you own your farm data. And it's also in the same way that Facebook says that once you put information on Facebook, many of you probably have Facebook. Uh, I don't happen to have one, but a Facebook page, you own your data. But is that really enough? I own it. What does that mean? So let's move further. So yes, I own it, but do I really control it? And is control really what's important here? So I just want to make clear right at the beginning that ag tech agreements typically require farmer consent for sharing data. However, when it happens, it might be on your iPhone. You've got your iPhone and you've just entered into an agreement with a new crop supplier, whatever it happens to be, pesticide, herbicides, and you download the software. And at the end, they have this little box that says, I consent. And that may be after 12 pages of small print on your iPhone. And so you do what most people do, which is say, I need that service or product. And so I consent. And I never read the agreement. We'll talk more about what it means not to read that agreement, but most people don't read that agreement. As much as I'd love that they would do that, they just don't. And for obvious reasons, those agreements are long, complicated. I'm an attorney I'm a contracts attorney, but as a state regulator at DACAP, I had to review advertisements for truthfulness. And I got to tell you, in some cases, this information that's in these contracts or provisions, they're hard for me to understand. And so I'm a trained, I guess you'd say, professional in reading contracts. And I sit there and say, what does that mean? I don't really understand that. So you're at a disadvantage not having had the legal background that I have. So most people, again, just avoid reading agreements. So let's talk about what's actually in those agreements. So I'm going to focus mostly on Bayer because, again, Bayer is the largest accumulator of ag data, both here in the United States and across the world. And what the agreement says is that, once again, you own your data, but by consenting at the end of the agreement, you agree to allow Bayer to share anonymized farm data with third parties. So what this means is Bayer can share your data once they take your name off, once they take your farm location off, but your crop production history and things like that, they will make sure there's no names attached to it, but then they'll start to combine it with data from other farms. Again, you gave consent most likely at the time you downloaded the software on your cell phone or iPad. So let's talk about provision 4.2. Again, this is from Bayer. And it says, we own any works that we generate. You can see the portion that I've highlighted on the screen in yellow. And so that means that any data that they've taken from farms and they've started to combine it with other farms and then used weather data and other things like that, that is a work that they've created. So they own that. So yes, you still own the data from your farm, but they've taken your data off farm, aggregated it with other farms, and now they own and control that data. So in the agreement in section 4.3, it says you grant us being Bayer, a non-exclusive license to access, use, reproduce, display, modify, and prepare derivative works based on your customer farm data. So it means they can take your data, manipulate it, do lots of different things with it, and you've given them the license to do it. Just again, by hitting that consent at the end of that multi-page agreement that was in probably 10 pica on your iPhone. So just I'm going to keep referring back to that because given my background in consumer protection, I do think it's kind of an unlevel playing field when we talk about these things. And the more producers like the more you can help protect yourself. In addition, there's other provisions in the agreement that say that we will not share your customer data with any non-affiliated third-party vendor or website owner for their marketing purposes without your consent. Now, in the case of Bayer, oftentimes they'll come back and ask for your consent to share the data, but in many cases, your ag technology provider and that original consent have incorporated that approval there as well. And there's no legal protections to say they got to keep coming back and asking you. If they kept coming back and asking you, it would flag it in your mind. They don't do that. And so you give that one consent, and then they're off to the races with how they use that data.
So Bill,
Yeah, go ahead,
quick
Cassie.
question here. So with the world that we're going in, it's rapidly changing. Technology is no different. It's probably going 3 times faster than what the rest of us can keep up with. But with all that in mind, what power do we as producer or the one that wants to use such technology that we can push back? Use it as a avenue of like negotiations to say like, okay,
Right.
either not necessarily monetize it, but what power do I have to say that, like, before it can be published, I want said things back, or in order to do this, I want X, Y, and Z. Like, what power do we have for negotiation or a little bit of pushback, or has it just gone too far up the chain that to slow it down is almost unheard of?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I'll be talking about some things that you can do to try to protect your farm data later on the presentation. But the horse, unfortunately, is really out of the barn. And what I mean by that is once the system got set up from a legal structure perspective through contracts, they've basically taken away the ownership and control from farmers. They've left ownerships of on-farm data with you, but control has been transferred to them. And in a normal contract negotiation, you'd have a back and forth. But can you imagine negotiating with Bayer to try to get Bayer to change the contract that they've done with millions of farmers here in the United States and across the globe? They are not going to negotiate with you on this. And so most farmers, I can think of a couple rare instances where the farm produces a certain percentage of U.S. ag production where they might have some bargaining power, but most farmers, unfortunately, don't have bargaining power. And I think that that means to the extent that we have problems or issues with this, that's where government may eventually have to step in. The Canadian government is very interested in this issue. They're looking at it. They're determining whether or not there should be legislation in Parliament. There's not something similar going on in the United States at this point, except perhaps in California. California is always at the front of data privacy issues. But otherwise, there's really no governmental or regulatory interest in this issue to date. And again, this is happening really over the last 5 years. And I'll have to say this with all respect to my fellow government regulators, since I was one. Many times the technology advances so rapidly, it's really hard for the regulators to catch up with that. And I think this is a really good case of that, or example of that. Again, contracts here control. The contracts are written one-sided. They're written by the manufacturer and their attorneys. And generally speaking, they're not trying to write provisions that are going to benefit farmers. That's just not how this is done. And so again, thanks for that great question. I hate to give that really kind of negative message, but part of the reason for doing this presentation is get farmers aware of this so that if they are concerned about it, you can decide which vendor you're going to do business with. And if your vendor is just going to take all of your ownership rights of your farm data, and you're going to have to read the agreement to understand that, but you may not want to do business with them. You may decide to use a competitor because they give you more rights in that contract than what the other party does. And unfortunately might be the wrong word, but it requires us all to learn a lot more about this and to pay attention to the agreements that you're getting. And that'll be the bottom line comment that I'll make towards the end as well. Let's see. So what can producers do? There is a body of law called intellectual property. And intellectual property helps protect things. So for example, and I'll fess up to this, I did the original trademark on the first Dairy Queen Blizzard. I was a young attorney in Minneapolis, and one of the partners came to me and said, Dairy Queen has this product. They want protection for it. Will you write the trademark for it? And I said, yes, absolutely. And little did I know how much I would enjoy Dairy Queen over the next 31 years, I think it has been, since I did that. It makes me feel old when they celebrate their anniversaries of the Blizzards. But there are 4 aspects to intellectual property. There's patent law, trademark law, copyright law, and trade secrets. Patent really doesn't apply here because we're not inventing anything. Trademark refers more to brands, and we're not typically branding anything, so that doesn't apply. Copyright and trade secrets may potentially apply. So what you need to first understand is you cannot copyright raw farm data. So if it's just raw production data, I got 240 bushels an acre for my corn. That's not in and of itself something that can be copyrighted. But if you start preparing a spreadsheet that says that I got this production from this particular seed versus production from a different type of seed, and I start comparing and contrasting and analyzing, that potentially can be copyrighted. And actually, copywriting is not very difficult. You've seen at the bottom with the C in the circle, with the year, and then the name of your farm business. But most farmers don't do that, and they don't know to do that. But copyright is one potential protection. Another is trade secret. Trade secret helps protect you where you've claimed something as confidential and not shared it with anybody else. The problem here is because you've allowed your technology provider, your seed salesperson or your pesticide herbicide dealer, put that smart device in to help track what's happened then with your crop. Is the You've given the information to another party. So you could potentially, by contract, enter into a confidentiality agreement with them. Again, most farmers don't think to do it. It costs money to hire an attorney to do that, but that is a possibility. But if you get challenged, it costs money to defend that in court. So I don't want to say that you don't have any protections in intellectual property, but they can be expensive to try to obtain that. So the reality is, I've surveyed farmers across the United States and Canada. Very, very few are using either copyrights or trade secrets. So as a result of this, the concern about data and who's using it, why they're using it, the industry, the ag business industry, has come together and they created a system called Ag Data Transparent. And you'll see the logo up in the top right corner, and it's a voluntary code of conduct for agribusinesses across the United States and Canada. And so they have a whole bunch of different provisions in that companies who get this seal of approval up in the top right are supposed to comply with. And one is to educate you as a producer what's in that contract that you're agreeing to. It makes it clear who owns, and in this case, farmers own the data. Makes clear that, okay, farmers own the data, but who has control and how can that data be used? Goes, what kind of notices do we have to give you if we change the agreement? You can see all those different things that are on the slide. This is meant by these agribusinesses agreed to do to this to help give you some tools to help protect yourself and some knowledge so that you know exactly what it is you're agreeing to. This is not a mandatory code. This is not required by law, whether it's federal law or state of Wisconsin. Again, this is a voluntary code. And there's really no way to enforce this other than removing the Ag Data Transparent seal from these companies. But one of the recommendations I would make to you is if you're going to go to a vendor and they have this Ag Data Transparent seal, that's probably a better vendor to do business with than one that does not. Because at least the company, the vendor that has a seal, has agreed to provide you with more information than what these other companies are going to do and give you a little bit better level of control. And so this is something that I want you to be aware of. Cassie, it looks like you're going to ask a question.
How are they validated? Like, do they just check their box? Like, yep, I pledge to do these things. Is it an honor system? Does someone double check? Like, how is this validated?
Yeah, so there is a group, there's a board of directors, and then they have a small staff. The small staff go through and determine whether or not the agribusiness qualifies for the Ag Data Transparent Seal. I haven't checked recently to see how many businesses, but there are quite a few well-known names that have agreed to this. And again, this is something I think that Wisconsin dairy farmers should be looking for when you're doing business with a vendor. And the industry did this because they know if they didn't do this, this is the slightly cynical side of me, and I don't mean to sound too cynical. If they didn't do this, then government regulators might start looking. And so they do this to try to say there's no need for government regulation. We're helping to provide this level of transparency. So moving on to data cooperatives. So the question has come up with given that farmers trust cooperatives, are there ways that the farm co-ops or co-ops created by farmers can hold this data and use this data for the advantage of farmers, and the advantage goes to the farmers, not to third parties, not to hedge funds, not to other people. And again, surveys demonstrate trust. And one of the largest holders, if not the largest holder of ag data, is the American Farm Credit System. And farm credit finances about 80% of the farmers in the United States. And of course, if you borrow from Farm Credit, you're a member owner. That's why you get a patronage check every year. You own the company. And because it's farmers on the board of directors, the farmers have decided the policy that we're not going to share your data that comes into Farm Credit with third parties. We're going to hold it within Farm Credit. And again, Farm Credit's a co-op. That's why they behave differently, because they're owned by farmers. And given this, then they take a much more protective attitude about what happens with the data that they've collected on their members, which is about 500,000 farmers across the United States. Cooperatives also create competition. So instead of Bayer holding all this data, is there an opportunity for farm cooperatives to hold data and compete more effectively with Bayer, or at least be able to challenge what recommendations are coming out from Bayer on their ag products? Local farm supply co-ops do that to some degree, but is there a greater opportunity to do this? There are a couple examples. There's the Texas-based Grower Information Service Cooperative, and they have found that it's difficult to get farmers across the United States to sign up for this data cooperative for broad purposes. But if it's focused on how do we best use this data to ensure that we're using as little water as possible, but yet achieving really good results, the co-op has really refocused its efforts in that way. There's a National Agricultural Producers Data Cooperative. Now, the name makes it sound like they're producers. It's mostly a group of universities that have come together. And then there's also the Ag Data Coalition, universities and agribusinesses. But to this date, there's not been a lot of effort by farmers to create their own cooperatives. And part of the question is, should farmers be more engaged in doing this to try to capture the value of the reams of, maybe reams the wrong word, but this vast amount of ag data that is being collected. So the bottom line on this is, yes, you absolutely own the farm data obtained through smart devices. In the contract, almost all the ag tech providers make it clear, not everyone, but most of the big ones do. However, the same contract allows your ag data provider to legally use, aggregate, and share your anonymized data. So again, remove your farm name and your farm location, but they can share it with third parties once it's aggregated, and they may not necessarily come back to you and ask you for permission because you already consented to it, and they're not going to share any of that income stream with you. They'll give you better, hopefully, analytics on how well their products function, but you're not going to get a revenue stream from this. And farmers do ask, is this fair? My data is providing you with some value. How am I getting that value back? I've already said this, but bottom line is, please read your ag tech agreement carefully. As painful as it is, as hurried as you are to use that product or service, but please do that. Don't just hit the accept icon without reading the agreement. I don't know how many times I can say that. I know most people aren't going to do it, but hopefully the folks that are listening today will be that rare group will say, yes, going forward, I'm going to do this. Because as we talked about with Cassie's earlier question, nearly impossible to negotiate provisions with these large companies. Their attorneys wrote the agreement. They're not going to negotiate with you on this. However, you still have the option to look at using a different farm input provider. So it might be one of those that has the ag data transparent seal, and you've got a little bit more comfort. So that may be a product that you decide to use going forward. So I don't want to leave you with a lot of negativity. This is a big issue. It's developing very, very rapidly. Folks like me are trying to keep up with it. Not sure I'll ever get ahead of it. But part of it is just educating all of you and myself as well about what does it mean to be in this digitized ag environment, and what does it mean to have small data and big data, and how do I get benefits from it? How are other people getting benefits from it? And is that balancing fair? Does it really benefit me? And so hopefully this has been beneficial. I'm going to stop my presentation at this point. I welcome any questions that you might have.
Absolutely. Again, Bill, thank you for this. Thank you for that deep dive. And I hope to have you back because, as you were alluding to, it's no limitation on where this could go. So to stay in front of it or attempt to stay in front of it, I think you will be back one or two more times to help.
That'd be great.
Into that again. So again, thank you for this even today. And again, as we were talking about a lot of the implications, a lot of the positive impacts it could have. But again, to protect your business or looking forward, just how do you button up a little bit? And I think you covered it all. I think you left me with all my questions very well answered. So again, thank you for your time here today. But before I say goodbye, and I think you hit it well on your bottom line thing, if there were two things that you wanted them to take action on today, what would be two things that you want them to walk away with?
So I said them just a moments ago, but redundancy is always good, especially as I get older. One is to read the agreement, know what's in that agreement, and ask the person who's presenting that agreement to you to explain it. Say, what kind of rights do I have as a farmer? And what kind of rights do you have under this agreement? Hardly anyone ever asks that question. And at the very least, you can ask those questions and see what kind of information you get. Number two, look for that egg data transparent seal. That at least will give you, and I have no financial interest in egg data transparent, want to assure everyone, no conflict of interest, but at least it'll assure you that you'll get disclosures that you might not otherwise get from other companies that are not part of that egg data transparent program. And so those would be the two big takeaways that I would have today.
Important ones indeed. So again, thank you for reiterating that, Bill. And for those that are tuning in here, again, this is Bill Olmacan. He's coming up with us with a plethora of background, but we're very fortunate to have us literally in our backyard with being part of the UW, the extension team. So again, thank you for your expertise and continuing to explore what this is going to continue to mean for us.
Thank you, Cassie.
As we do wrap up today's Dairy Signal, again, thank you for Bill and his expertise, but it would be a shame and almost a crime if I didn't say thank you to our national partners, those that help PDPW not only execute programs like the Dairy Signal, but what you see happen throughout our calendar year. So again, thank you to our partners that stand with PDPW, but truly the reason for partnering and working with PDPW is because of the producers, the fellow dairymen across the country and even globally that the Dairy Signal has been able to reach. So again, thank you to those partners. You can probably check them if you're watching here on the Dairy Signal on the platform. You can see that listing come up. But another great way to see not only our partners, our national partners, but also a lot of our premier suppliers that we have the ability to work with and in turn fellow dairymen have at their fingertips. I encourage you to check out Prime. So you can access it through our website, but it lists a whole bunch of premier suppliers that are out there in the industry. And you can even categorize it based on what you're looking for. So if you need I don't want to call it a numbing scroll, but if you're like, oh, I want to look into more of the seed, or I want to look into more of my animal nutrition aspects, just give it a search. I encourage you to, again, seek out Prime and see how that could be a utilized tool on your behalf. But without further ado, guys, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Dairy Signal, and hopefully we can see you back on another episode coming up not only tomorrow. So take care, everyone.